In 1970, the movie Patton won 7 Academy Awards, but for tank enthusiasts, it is famous for something completely different: the armor. If you've ever watched the opening battle sequences and thought, wait, those aren't Panzers, you are in the right place. Today, we are cataloging every single piece of armor used in the film, why they used them, and exactly how historically inaccurate they really are. The tanks that made one of cinema's greatest war films possible, yet none of them actually fought in World War II. In the 1970 epic Patton, every single tank rolling across the screen was an anachronism. American-made vehicles from the 1950s masquerading as both Allied and German armor from the 1940s. When Schaffner set out to create his biographical masterpiece about General George Patton, he faced an impossible challenge. The U.S. Army wouldn't cooperate with the production, and even if they had, the tanks, aircraft, and equipment needed to authentically recreate World War II battles simply didn't exist in operational condition anymore. What followed was one of the most elaborate military masquerades in film history, involving Franco's Spanish army, 200 tanks, 3,000 troops, and a budget that would consume half of the film's $12 million production cost. The irony runs deeper than simple historical inaccuracy. The very tanks used to portray German armor, the M48 Pattons, were named after the American general the film was celebrating. Picture this: tanks bearing the name Patton painted with German markings, firing at other American tanks painted to look like Shermans, is all in service of telling the story of the man whose tactical brilliance inspired their very creation. This wasn't laziness or ignorance on the part of the filmmakers. It was pure necessity wrapped in Cold War politics, Spanish cooperation, and the harsh reality that by 1969, the authentic machinery of World War II had largely vanished from active service. The story begins in 1951, 6 years after General Patton's death in a car accident. Hollywood first approached his widow, Beatrice, about making a film celebrating her husband's legacy. She refused outright. When Beatrice died in 1953, hopes were revived. But now Patton's children, George Patton IV and his daughter Ruth, campaigned vigorously against any film production. Based on their opposition, the U.S. Army agreed not to provide any support for such a project. It took more than a decade to change their minds. By the time George Patton IV and Ruth finally agreed to support the film in the mid-1960s, the American military landscape had completely transformed. The Sherman tanks that had carried the Third Army across Europe were museum pieces. The German Panzers and Tigers they had faced were even rarer. Most had been destroyed in combat, scrapped for metal, or were rusting in forgotten corners of Europe. Enter Franco's Spain. Through a quirk of Cold War politics and the U.S. military assistance program, the Spanish Army had acquired substantial quantities of American military equipment from the early 1950s, in tanks that were too new to have fought in World War II, but old enough to be expendable for a Hollywood production. Franco saw an opportunity for international prestige and economic benefit, while the filmmakers saw their salvation. Producer Frank McCarthy, himself a retired brigadier general, negotiated an extraordinary deal. The Spanish Army would provide not just equipment, but personnel. In the snowy Battle of the Bulge sequences alone, Spain supplied 200 tanks and 3,000 troops, half dressed in German uniforms, half in American. For the Battle of El Guetar scene, filmed in a single day in the desert country outside Almeria, over 2,000 Spanish soldiers transformed into Germans and Americans of 1943. The centerpiece of this deception was the M48 Patton tank, and which portrayed German armor throughout the film. Introduced to U.S. service in 1953, the M48 was a revolutionary design, the first American medium tank with a 4-man crew, featuring a distinctive boat-shaped hull and massive cast turret. At 40.8 tons with 4-inch thick frontal armor and a powerful 90mm main gun, the M48 was the most heavily armored tank in American service at the time. But in Patton, these technological marvels were disguised as German Tigers and Panthers. The Spanish crews removed muzzle brakes, applied elaborate camouflage schemes, and painted German crosses and tactical numbers on the sides. To the casual viewer, they looked menacing and foreign enough to pass for Nazi armor. The irony was lost on most audiences. They were watching tanks named after an American general and crewed by Spanish soldiers, pretending to be German weapons that had never actually existed in the configurations shown. Representing American armor was an equally anachronistic collection. collection. The M41 Walker Bulldog, developed in 1951 for reconnaissance missions, became the film's primary stand-in for the legendary Sherman tank. At 26 tons with a 76mm gun and capable of 45 miles per hour, the M41 was actually superior in many ways to the Shermans it was portraying. The real Shermans of World War II were 30-ton medium tanks with 75mm guns, reliable and numerous, but hardly the sleek, fast vehicles audiences saw in Patton. Adding to the collection were M46 and M47 Patton tanks, the immediate predecessors to the M48. The M47, standardized in 1952, was the last American tank to mount a bow machine gun in the hull. At 50 tons, with a 90mm main gun and a 5-man crew, it was far more sophisticated than any tank that had rolled across North Africa in 1943. Yet there it was, painted in olive drab with white stars, representing the armor that had carried Patton's Third Army to victory. The technical specifications tell the story of how far tank technology had advanced in the decade after the war. The M48's armor protection ranged from 4.72 inches on the hull front to just under 1 inch on the turret top. Compare that to the Sherman's maximum of 3 inches of frontal armor. The 90mm guns mounted on the M46, M47, and M48 were dramatically more powerful than the Sherman's 75mm. And these weren't just different tanks. They represented an entirely new generation of armored warfare. What makes this particularly fascinating is what the Germans actually used during the periods depicted in the film. The Tiger I, which began operational duty in 1942, mounted the fearsome 88mm gun that had originally been designed as an anti-aircraft weapon. Only 1,347 Tiger I tanks were ever built, making them relatively rare even during the war. The Tiger II, or King Tiger, was even more exclusive. Heavy Allied bombing limited production to just 492 vehicles. The most common German tank by 1943 was actually the Panzer IV, a medium tank that had been continuously upgraded throughout the war. The Panther tank, introduced in 1943, was Germany's answer to the Soviet T-34 and represented the pinnacle of German tank design. But by 1969, finding operational examples of any German World War II tank was virtually impossible. This is where Special Effects Chief Alex Weldon and his Spanish crew demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. Recognizing that some scenes required tanks to be destroyed, they built elaborate replicas from sheet metal and fiberglass. Cinematographer Fred Konekamp later recalled discovering these fake tanks on the stages at Sevilla Studios. They looked like the real thing, but as I got up close to them, I discovered they had been made of sheet metal and fiberglass by Weldon and his Spanish crew. He had built them from photographs. They were later blown up in the battle scenes. The scale of the operation was staggering, and filming took place at 71 locations across 6 countries. But Spain provided the backbone of military hardware and personnel. The rental of troops and equipment consumed nearly half the film's $12 million budget, an enormous sum for 1969. The Spanish Army essentially became a for-hire military film unit, providing everything from tank crews to aircraft maintenance. Consider the logistics involved in the Battle of the Bulge sequences, filmed near Segovia when the production crew rushed north after receiving word that snow had fallen. Hundreds of tanks had to be repainted from desert camouflage to winter schemes. Thousands of Spanish soldiers had to be outfitted in period uniforms, half as Americans, half as Germans. The choreography of moving this mechanical army around Spain and positioning it for different battles across different theaters of war represented a massive undertaking. The attention to detail in some areas was remarkable. Tank commanders were equipped with Browning M2 aircraft machine guns, appropriate for the period. The Spanish Army provided not just the vehicles, but the expertise to operate them convincingly. Spanish tank crews spent weeks learning to maneuver their vehicles in formations that would look authentic to audiences familiar with World War II combat footage. Yet the fundamental anachronism remained inescapable. Every tank in the film was not just from the wrong war, but from the wrong decade. The M41 Walker Bulldog portraying Sherman tanks wasn't even conceived until 6 years after World War II ended. The M48 Patton tanks portraying German armor were designed by the same nation that had defeated Germany, using lessons learned from fighting the very tanks they were now pretending to be. This created some genuinely surreal moments. In one scene, tank commanders fire from M41 Walker Bulldogs, standing in stand-in for M4 Shermans as German bombers strafe Patton's headquarters. The bombers themselves were Spanish Casa 2.111s, license-built versions of German Heinkel 111s, but the tanks responding to the attack were American designs from 1951, pretending to be American designs from 1942. The production team tried various methods to disguise the anachronisms. Muzzle brakes were removed from guns to change their silhouettes. Camouflage patterns were carefully applied to break up the recognizable shapes. The German crosses and tactical numbers were painted with painstaking accuracy. But to a trained eye, the deception was obvious. These tanks moved differently, sounded different, and had proportions that no World War II vehicle had ever possessed. The irony extended beyond just the naming convention. The M46, M47, and M48 were all developed based on lessons learned from World War II tank combat. American engineers had studied German tank design, examined captured vehicles, and incorporated the best features into new designs. The M48's boat hull was inspired by German engineering. Its fire control systems were improvements on German range-finding technology. In a sense, these tanks were the children of the vehicles they were portraying. For audiences in 1970, most of these details passed unnoticed, and tank warfare was tank warfare, and few civilians could distinguish between a 1943 Sherman and a 1953 M41 at a distance, especially when painted in appropriate colors and fitted with period markings. The Spanish Army crews performed their roles convincingly, and the battle sequences achieved their intended dramatic impact. But for military historians and tank enthusiasts, Patton became a catalog of anachronisms. Every vehicle identification was wrong. Every technical specification was from the wrong era. The film that purported to tell the story of World War II armor warfare was actually showcasing the Cold War generation of tanks that had never fired a shot in anger. The production faced other limitations that further emphasized the gap between historical accuracy and practical filmmaking, and they could only locate two Heinkel 111 bombers in flying condition, both operated by the Spanish Air Force. Ground vehicles were easier to source, but still required extensive modification to look period appropriate. This wasn't unique to Patton. War films of the 1960s and 1970s routinely used whatever military equipment was available, regardless of historical accuracy. The philosophy was pragmatic. A tank was a tank, and as long as the same vehicle didn't appear on both sides of a battle, most producers were satisfied. Authenticity was less important than spectacle, but Patton represented the high-water mark of this approach. Never before had so much military equipment been deployed for a single film production. Never again would a foreign army essentially become a film studio's military wing. The Spanish cooperation was unprecedented, and the results were spectacular, even if historically impossible. The film's success vindicated the approach. Patton grossed $61.7 million against its $12 million budget, won 7 Academy Awards, and became a cultural phenomenon. Richard Nixon became obsessed with the film, screening it repeatedly at the White House and aboard the presidential yacht. Theater owners reported that soldiers in audiences would often stand and snap to attention when they heard the opening line, "Ten Hut," assuming it was a real call to attention. None of this would have been possible with historically accurate equipment. The surviving Sherman tanks were in museums or private collections. The few operational German tanks were precious artifacts and unsuitable for the rigorous demands of film production. Using modern equipment painted to look period appropriate wasn't just practical, it was the only option. Today, the standards have changed dramatically. When the makers of Fury wanted to use a Tiger tank in 2014, they borrowed the only operational Tiger one in the world from the Tank Museum at Bovington. Modern audiences, armed with internet research and high-definition displays, demand greater authenticity. The casual deceptions that worked for Patton would be immediately spotted and endlessly criticized, but Patton stands as a monument to practical filmmaking and international cooperation. It proved that with enough imagination, political cooperation, and Spanish Army tanks, Hollywood could recreate the greatest tank battles of World War II, even if every single vehicle was from the wrong war. The tanks may have been anachronistic, but the story they helped tell was timeless. And that's the real victory of this remarkable cinematic deception.